incentive programs and how do we avoid the mistakes on incentives in House Bill 3. I think of this in sort of 4 buckets of key lessons and key things from a planning perspective. One is virtually every foray that has happened on this has been a temporary foray. So there was a rider, a grant, or a kind of sort of sidebar initiative that wasn't written as a statutory entitlement, and so it was a here today, gone tomorrow deal. That was clearly a lesson learned. This kind of initiative is about investing in people. That's something that is cumulative over time. So one of the things they did in House Bill 3 is this is not a rider, it's not a grant, it's a formula entitlement. It's in the law, it's an allotment. So they have to actually change the law to get rid of it in order for it to go away. And the removal of allotments happens very rarely by the legislature. It does happen, but very rarely. So, they meet every 2 years. They can rewrite all the laws. So the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. However, one lesson is their just structural approach to the allotment is fundamentally different than before in the way that it was funded and authorized. The second one was the nature of evaluations. What I sometimes would refer to as the sort of brother-in-law special. You get the bonus, but not you, and not for any reason that's clear. And so this requires a high degree of inter-rater reliability, and actually I can get into much more detail on it, but it requires basically people have to legitimately agree this is an effective evaluation. Multiple parties would have to agree to try to make it so that it's transparent for teachers to understand. Another key lesson from the past is you can't have caps on the number or percentage of teachers that are eligible because that sets up a situation where I can only give out 10 of these, so you 10 get it, but not you 10, because that kills the collaborative nature of the school. So it's been structured basically everybody could potentially get it. Everybody ain't, but it's like there's not a mathematical cap to it. The last key lesson that I think about, and this isn't so much a function of law, it's a function of how we talk about it. You don't have teachers that are like, if you paid me 10 grand more, I'd work harder for you. Like that doesn't exist. The incentives don't make teachers better at their jobs. And it's important for us to sort of recognize that's not what we're talking about. The way teachers get better at their jobs is reflecting, is instructional coaching, is in investing in their practice and their craft. What the money does is it helps them be teachers longer than they might otherwise be teachers, and it potentially has an effect on recruitment. And so this is not necessarily a lesson that's embedded in the law, but it is a lesson that we talk about from a technical assistance perspective in terms of how we talk about this generally. So that's the 4 key lessons from past forays and how this one is different. Next one, where's funding for the reading academies? So there is no itemized funding for reading academies. It is the aggregate funding. So aggregate funding went up by $3.4 billion this year. So last year we were spending about $60 billion all in. This year we're spending $63.5 billion all in. So the sort of high-level summary for House Bill 3 is that you were required to do 3 new things. You're required to give about 1/3 of that money in pay raises, and then you're required to do pre-K and you're required to do the reading academies. So that's the sort of big picture. So with $3 billion to do that, it's the very essence of a funded mandate. However, I know how the formulas work, and it didn't land that way for everybody. So some of you, your budgets went up by like 12%. Some of you, your budgets went up by like 0.5%. And everybody got the requirements. So for those of you where your budgets went up only a little bit, you got work to do. But from a broad, if I'm putting my legislator hat on, like thinking from the big picture lens, there was clearly funding to do this. It's just, it's hard to like universally fund everything and also address core issues of equity in the school finance system. So like some people got a lot and some people got a little. So anyways, that's at least my hot sports opinion on where the funding is for reading academies. Clearly you can use the early education allotment. You can likely use comp ed for it. If you have tier 2 money in your own district, you can do that. I mean, there's any number of, You can do it out of your sort of core sort of basic allotment. There's any number of places inside your buckets of money that you can pull from for it.
I think that's going to be a question that is going to come to legislators early and often. Once folks have gotten far enough along to actually sit down and do the math.
Yeah.
This is what full-day pre-K cost me. This is what radio academies cost me. I think that question is going to come up, Senator.
Yeah, I think that I know that because I've already been hearing it from both chairmen, because they're like, hey, people keep asking me about this stuff, and I was like, you're going to hear a lot more of it, because for any individual district, you may be in a land of plenty, and you got like reading academies, pre-K raises, and then you got a heck of a lot of money left over of new money. And then for a decent number of districts, that won't be necessarily the case, and then you're going to have to reprioritize your internal PD budget accordingly. I mean, there's Title II, and there's a bunch of other things that can be used for parts and bits and pieces of it, but people are going to clearly have to make some changes in the way they're spending money. There's also for reading academies, I mean, you have to change your instructional calendar in all likelihood to make sure you set up in-service days for reading academies. It's work, it's good work, but everybody's budget is a little bit different as a result of how the bill sort of works its way through the system. The sustainability of future funding. So this is clearly a legislative question. I can tell you what I know of the school finance system and how I understand the legislative process just from my chair, how it unfolds. So the first thing is, a lot of people think this is lip service, but from my observation, funding K-12 education is clearly the legislature's #1 priority, like every single session. People don't believe that to be true, but at least what I see, the evidence would say it is true. Like if there's cuts, they take it out of roads or water or somewhere else. Higher ed, actually, even before K-12 happens. And when new money gets put in first and foremost to K-12, and then stuff after that. Whether that's enough is like a different
and
question.
I would say that we have a commitment for the sustainability. And we knew going in that it was going to be expensive. We stuck $11 billion out there. 6+ for school, 5+ in reducing the tax burden, property tax burden on people. And every session we're going to be tweaking and trying to look at dollars, but we are committed. The internet sales tax those dollars will be part of our funding. Anything greater than $300 million from the land commissioner, we can, our land office, we can get those dollars put over. We are, if we have to, we do cuts in other things, but we set this as a priority. Our other, let's see, oil and gas. We're growing
5%.
Oil and gas, and that 25% of that severance tax goes to schools also, goes to education, and there's different things we can do with the rainy day fund. We will not take out of the rainy day fund for ongoing sustainability and expenses, but we can always tweak some other things as the dollars go to the rainy day fund. We don't want to deplete our savings account, if you will. But we talked about a whole lot of things, and it was a patchwork of how can we fund this. But every senator was on board trying to find a way to make sure it's sustainable. Every session, we're going to have to revisit it, but everything we put forward, we do not plan to take away. Make sense?
Well, another thing to bear in mind is how all this works at the macro level. So what causes aggregate cost increases? What causes the state to spend more in public education? There's like 3 things. One is if they choose to increase per pupil spending for any number of ways that can happen. 2 is there's more pupils. And then 3 is other offsets, basically local property tax revenue, doesn't take it away. So the law changed on property tax revenue so that you won't see like the local share spike up over time because as your values go up, you're able to float rates down on the M&O side, which you've always done on the INS side, but you've never been really allowed to on the M&O side. So that's going to happen, but that actually is not a cost increase. That's just there's less new money coming in on the property tax side. So back to the cost increase, it's like per pupil spending increases or pupils increase. We had been and this is something, this has been a relevant fact to long-term sustainability for House Bill 3. We have been, over about a 15-year period, seeing about 70,000 new kids added to Texas public schools per year. So it's like the equivalent of an Austin popping up every single year. And 70,000 new kids at 10 grand a head. I mean, that's a lot of new budget pressure placed on the state. In the last 3 years, that dropped to 45, then 35, then 15. And what that means is that the ability to sustain the per pupil spending on a go-forward basis is actually a lot better than it used to be. And the reason we've seen that decline in growth rates is because there was this very big dip in birth rates after the Great Recession. And that is working its way through the system. I can actually see that in the aggregate numbers. You can actually see exactly when it happened because it's a decline between, I think, 5th graders and 4th graders. It's just working through the entirety of the system. So that also means that, like, the near-term budget pressures that we would have been under for session after session after session, they're not facing. So it's for the foreseeable future, there's really not that big of a huge concerns. Now, if something happens to the price of oil, then we might have a problem. But anyways, at least that's what I understand the sustainability of the system. Funding sustainability, more on TAV. TAV, help me on that one.
Was that?
Yeah, it's the 2.5%.
Taxable appraised values?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We're
Well,
going back.
it just means you're going to collect more money on property taxes than you would. As property values grow, you collect more property taxes. It used to be, however, that was an unbridled increase, which meant that the state used to just put in less and less and less, and then your local property taxpayers paid more and more and more. Now your M&O rates will float down anytime your local property appraisal base grows by more than 2.5%. And even your base doesn't have to grow by 2.5%. If the state base grows by more than 2.5%, everybody's rates go down. So what has happened is M&O is going to float in a way that's analogous to the way INS has always floated, based upon the property tax base. So that doesn't actually take any money out of your budgets. It means the funding component that's provided by property taxes will grow far less than it did under the previous unconstrained model.
So you don't view this as a second ASETAR then?
No, that really has nothing to do with ASETAR. There is kind of a little mini ASETAR, but ASETAR's going away.
No, I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
Hopefully our recapture is gone.
Teacher incentive, I talked about some of the lessons learned. This just has asked for more info on the teacher incentive allotment. So it's an entitlement, it's an allotment, so it's like limitless. Long term, we think that that's probably going to generate about $1.5 billion per year into the system for use in raising teacher salaries. It'll take 5 to 10 years for that to scale up, because it'll depend on how quickly y'all choose to go there. And I assume a bunch of people are just going to choose not to, because it's all optional. I have a full presentation on that too. That next time I'm at the Regional Service Center, I'll do a deep dive on that. Sustainability, timeline, and implementation of the Reading Academies. So we have, originally our reading of the statute was that we had to get everybody through in the next 2 years. We have slightly tweaked our reading of the statute, so we think we can get everybody through in the next 3 years. That's a very material benefit. They start this summer. So we have done 2 videos on the Reading Academies. If you haven't seen them, just raise your hand if you saw the first one. That was the House Bill 3 and 30 video on reading practices. And then have you seen the second one? Also raise your hand. So we have a third one that's scheduled for release, I think, this week, and then we have a session at TASA. We're working through all the logistics. It's like we got 100,000 people we get to put through this in the next 3 or 4 years. So this is a big deal. We're trying to figure out how we do this in a way that drives costs down as rapidly as possible, and that is easy to implement at that scale as possible, while being legitimate training for our teachers and art and science of reading. When will models be available for the teacher incentive allotment? So we've got like communities of practice. There's 2 different groups of districts that are working together. There's about a dozen or so districts that have basically already done this in their districts. So we're using them to sort of publish guidebooks for other districts. But I would expect to see sort of like templates that you could potentially follow available as soon as this summer, and then they will get better and better over time as we have experience with more and more districts doing this.
Reading Academies, the funding, implementation plan, I think you talked about, teacher incentive allotment, you talked about that, the sustainability, we talked about that. Fast growth allotment, if you wanted to.
Yes, so I've gotten a lot of requests, including from Senator Campbell, to use my rulemaking authority to tweak fast growth allotment. We have, as of yet, not done so. My apologies. This is an issue that we have been surfacing with leadership in both chambers as to whether or not there would be something they might consider as a structural change in the next session for the fast growth allotment, just given the way that it works. I've gotten a lot of feedback from a bunch of different districts, including Schertz, Cibolo here in the area, on ways that allotment could be better. Ultimately, this is a legislative question, not a TEA question. We do have rulemaking authority, but our rules are to implement the statute as it was discussed during the session. Whether or not this is something they take up in like a kind of a cleanup tweak, House Bill 3, unintended consequences next session, there's going to have to be some little minor HB 3 follow-up bill.
That we always put out cleanup things.
And this will it'll be a question for the legislature as to whether or not they want to tackle it. This will be dicey for them to tackle because it's going to create winners and losers and projections. Anyways, that's what I know about fast growth.
Yeah, and I would just say when you do come to, we are having our interim committee hearings. While that one that's not one of the interim charges, I don't think. But you may just, and by the way, if you can tackle fast growth, it puts out there that you've got the question. So the more we hear about that, somebody's going to, then it sets it up as a concern because we know our superintendents and schools need
Senator
that.
Campbell, you have, on the interim charges, you have HB3 relating to school finance.
Okay, so
monitoring it. So
we'll make
So that
sure,
would be a good
Carrie, make
one.
sure that we do put fast growth as something we talk about.
Thanks.
Again, sustainability, dollars, timeline, spending requirements for fiscal year 20.
So that may be related to the all spending requirements, because all the allotments, actually not all the allotments, but a lot of the allotments have, you have to spend 53% of it or something like that on your, in that particular programmatic area. That may be related just to the pay raises, but if the law has a spending requirement on something, then you gotta spend it on that. And if you don't, then either we will give you a corrective action plan or you will fix it without said corrective action plan, but it will in fact have to be spent because that's what the law requires.
Okay. We talked about reading academies, and that's more than 3, so if we have time, we can come back. We have more than 3 here. Funding sustainability. What is that?
Reading academies.
Reading academies, thank you. We talked
And then
about that.
current year versus prior year. So the one of the many changes in the bill was to use prior year or current year values instead of prior year values. If you're in a place that has seen consistent property growth, all things being equal, you probably like the use of prior year values. If you're in a place where you see variations in your property value growth, then you may not have never thought about it, but you're likely better off with current year values than prior year values. If you're in a place with declining growth, there's no question you're better with current year values. Most of the state had seen property value growth, so most of the state thought that they liked prior year values, but what it did was it created a funding disequity, obviously, between districts based solely on local property wealth. So they fixed the funding disequity. Everybody's still better off because everybody's net funding increased, but if you were like, hey, if I could have gotten House Bill 3 and kept prior year values, there's a decent number of people that would have wanted that. But there is no House Bill 3 with prior year values. The nice thing is it represents, if you think about the history of all the school finance cases starting in Edgewood way back, it's like, hey, we should resource every kid based on the needs of the kid, not based on what happens to be the property wealth of their area. And that change in particular, the current year values change, is like the finished product of all of that all of that advocacy, because on the M&O side of your budget, your local property base is almost entirely irrelevant to your budget. It's not entirely, but it's like almost entirely irrelevant. Every district is funded based solely on student need, with two exceptions. One is the fast growth allotment, and the other is the small district allotment. But other than that, kids can move across the street and they're worth the same amount of money, and that did not used to be the case. It really was not the case until the passage of House Bill 3, and that current year prior year value is one of the big reasons for that.
And when we did change to current year values, the clawback that we really never got, those dollars were then able to be put into the basic allotment, and that's how we have more equity.
Yeah, it just redistributes. So instead of like Dallas that had 10% property value gain one year and it just benefits the kids in Dallas, it's like, no, the kids in Dallas aren't worth any more than the kids anywhere else. Everybody's getting funded the same based on student need.
Right. Okay, additional days, half funding, why require 180 days before eligible? If I read that right.
Yes, so that's the additional days, school year incentives. So I think the underlying policy rationale is the desire by the legislature is to give the kids more exposure to more instruction, and the more days that they're exposed to, the less you're going to be exposed to summer slide issues and that sort of thing. So it is in fact a matter of daily exposure based on what went into that policy.
Okay. Any questions about HB3 before we move on? I want to make sure we're going on time. All right, let's go to SB 11. Again.
So the first question I have a hard time understanding, it said plans on structure of safety consortium. So I don't know who asked this question, but help me understand what the safety consortium is.
Mental health, or is it?
There's just a negative unintended outcome to adding board members to it and the posting of the meetings, is that right?
Right, so what has happened is when we first started having these committee meetings,
So I don't even know what the safety consortium is that you're referring to. That was my question.
District safety committees?
District safety committees?
Is that what you're referring to?
Of the safety.
Oh, this like similar to the district advisory committees, except there was, you got one on safety, and one of the requirements is board members are there, and if enough board members are there, you gotta post the meetings. Yeah.
And then
it really limits the open forum on safety and security.
Is there a specific requirement for like a set number of board members, or does it just happen to be in your district that you have
President and one other designated.
president and one other member?
Yes.
Well, you don't have to post those.
No, but what's happened is that.
You gotta tell all your other board members not to show up.
Right, and what's happened is that the more board members that want to participate.
Yeah, I can see
then
why.
it shuts
Having
down.
run for office twice, I can see why I'd show up to that meeting, even if uninvited.
Yeah, so the question
That's,
really is,
that's
there any-
interesting. We'll, I think this is then an
It'll
area
have to
for
be
potential
something
policy
looks
review.
like we tweak or look into and see how much of a problem it is with other school board members wanting to show up at other meetings, safety meetings.
Because essentially you're talking about the posting requirement, and that puts a chilling effect on the openness of the communication.
Correct.
Yeah, got it.
It makes it almost.
That's the first I've heard of it. How many districts are experiencing this problem in the room?
Regardless of board members, they fall under Open Meetings Act.
Oh, really?
It does give us the ability to go into closed session.
But it's hard to put 30 people in closed
It
session.
absolutely is.
Yeah, there are conversations that need to be had in that room that are not appropriate for media.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Okay.
I was actually a passionate advocate for closed, untransparent government in this particular arena, in the last interim session.
In our zeal for transparency, we've shut down on conversations that the statute is intended for
Okay.
folks to have.
Important, it's part of what this is, we'll look at that. Okay, the future of school safety and sustainability,
So
proactive, reactive.
I think you're talking about here, the allotments, it's a $9.72 per kid allotment. So I don't anticipate that going anywhere, much like I don't anticipate anything else. That's a little easier to go away, the way it's structured, but like I just don't see that going away. So I mean, this will be an
Right.
issue for the legislature's prerogative as to whether they continue, expand, contract.
I mean, some of the dollars were first-time dollars to get stuff started. Whether or not we'll need the same amount, we have to look at that.
Yeah, the Senate Bill 500 money, I wouldn't count on but it happens to be the same total dollar amount, because you put $100 million in a one-time money, and then you put
Yes.
$100 million per year into the allotment. I think this question is about the allotment, but assuming you're asking about Senate Bill 500, I think you gotta assume that that's not
It
gonna.
was from our table, and it was about the allotment. We appreciate the legislature putting in that allotment. I know it wasn't as big as what we talked about at the beginning, but that allows us to be proactive and hit things like mental health and counselors and those types of things, those ongoing costs. So we'd hope that we could see that continue and beefed up a little bit.
Well, I know there is a lot of sentiment to support our counselors, so I don't see that going away. Dollars that are dedicated, if you will,
For mental health.
to counselors, mental health, there's just a lot of work to do out there, so I don't see those kind of dollars going away. All right,
So will the $9.72 go up?
let's not talk about going up. Let's talk about trying to keep, right?
What's the timeline for the School Safety Center to release guidelines on threat assessment? Do we have any insight on what their timeline is, Alejandro?
Yes, they're actually posted already on the school safety website.
That you got posted
Model
like
policies.
this week or something, or?
A week ago.
Yeah.
And I don't think they have it all finished, right?
No, we got a bunch of stuff we gotta do yet. They're working pretty
They're working.
furiously.
Right.
They got like 20 or something staff members this session for school safety, and we got 0. But we are working, we're working as fast as we can.
Will the legislature consider providing resources for early intervention measures in relation to school safety? Well, we put a lot of dollars out there, so let's use what you've got and see, where is there a shortfall and why? Or what can you do to be creative and keep the schools hardened against trauma or mayhem?
When legislation is passed, there's a need to expedite communication to districts with a realistic time frame to implement. So this strikes me as clearly a homework assignment for us about communicating about these things. We have prioritized communication about House Bill 3 because it's like the 800-pound gorilla, and hopefully our communications have been fairly effective for y'all. On this, we reckon there's actually a couple more questions that are sort of similar. We recognize there's a Safe and Healthy Schools initiative, or Safe and Supportive Schools initiative in statute that doesn't exist, and we have to create rules on it. And theoretically, there's nothing for you to do until we create rules on it. Threat assessment is a different animal. That requirement came into practice already, and so following known threat assessment models in good faith, nobody should be waiting on us to do that. And now the School Safety Center has at least some threat assessment protocol documentation. So for the Safe and Supportive Schools thing, you're still waiting on us, and for threat assessment, all systems go this year. But regardless, I think it's fair criticism that we need to communicate more regularly about this. We've communicated pretty extensively about House Bill 3, but not nearly as extensively about Senate Bill 11. So we're trying to figure out how we get more information out on this.
Commissioner, when are you releasing the data collection, the deadline next month?
Yeah, so there is a new data collection requirement related to Senate Bill 11 too. So we have timelines and what that is, and we're gonna have to update sort of TSDS and data collection systems for that. But expect to see some intel on that next month. And it's like, how often does your threat assessment team meet? There's a whole bunch of requirements and statute related data collection on this. LEAs need rules prior to implementation. That's what we just talked about. Need longer implementation timelines. Yeah, so that I'm also sensitive to. Like House Bill 3 is going to take us a good 5 to 6 years to implement. Like there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Like 5 to 6 years to implement just that one piece of legislation. Senate Bill 11 is also going to take some significant chunk of time. Like the expectation is in the statute is that everybody's doing threat assessments for every campus effective September 1 of last year. Virginia passed the threat assessment requirement after the Virginia Tech shooting. They are currently at 25% of LEAs trained on threat assessment practices, and that was many years ago. So we're trying to think through like the logistics of all the training systems and support systems that need to exist. Mind you, we got like no staff to do any of this work, so we're we're trying to be as supportive as rapidly as possible. I don't want to make excuses, but I do recognize that it's going to be a while before like all this stuff is stood up. I don't think you need to worry about like us from a compliance police perspective. The only thing that actually needs to exist is your multi-hazard plans need to exist, and frankly, you guys all have those already.
Yeah, I appreciate that on your end. I think our comment, that was our table. The comment is really for interim charges as you're going forward into the next legislative session. As, just like as you're thinking through this, like building in instead of stuff that's effective. Like from
Right,
the
because we
legislative end,
normally
yeah.
have things effective September 1.
Yeah.
Effective May of next year. So try to, that,
So like, I
that's
appreciate
good.
you, but like that's what the legislation.
But blame me,
Got it.
I got it. But that's reasonable. And some things we have urgent, you know, at the end of May, same year, and some is the following year, but that's true. Make sure, Carrie.
The last one is some more specifics on threat assessments. Example, the reporting stuff. So again, the reporting stuff's coming out in a few weeks from us, what the reporting requirements will be. Not enough money.
I've heard that before.
Okay. Need to address adolescent health and not just hardening. I mean, I think we generally agree with that. The only money that is limited to hardening is the one-time Senate Bill 500 money. All the other money you can spend on all this other stuff. It's just a question of whether or not it's enough money for your purposes or whether you pull from other funding sources inside the district for those activities. Need counselors, more time for them, and money for lower ratios.
Right, we agree there's a lot of need for counselors, and counselors don't need to be monitoring tests, they need to be doing what they're licensed to do. So, it's been an issue since I've been there. Each session, it seems like it gets a little bit better. More counselors, more dollars, so we will keep working on that. I don't see that going away, as I said a while ago. There's a need for counselors.
What I would tell you on this is just from my interaction with y'all is, and every time you get a very specific allotment for a very specific purpose, my sense, at least from my conversations with y'all, is that is both good and bad. Like your CFO and all your accounting people have to do all this extra work. You can only spend it on that thing. It complicates the efficiency with which you're planning expenditures. So if you're asking the legislature for more money for counselors, you should expect like a council allotment that can only be spent on counselors. And that may or may not be like the actual solution to this problem. I wanted to put that out there. And frankly, like right now, all of you have more than enough money to have like a 1-to-1 counseling ratio, just about. You just have to fire all of your other staff. So like a lot of this comes down to your own sort of budget prioritization decisions as to how you want to staff. Santa Fe had more police officers. Santa Fe ISD had more sworn police officers per student than any district that I've ever seen. And so they made that decision to do that. That meant that those could have been teachers or counselors or something else, and you kind of wonder like, what if? And you don't know. Like all those are unanswerable questions. But all I would say is generally the feedback I've gotten from y'all is like you don't like bucket specific money. If that is different, please let me know because I want to make sure I'm giving good guidance to the legislature on this.
I think you're on target. Because it makes it easier when dollars are fungible, but we know that, so. But we put a lot out there last session, so,
$3.4 billion new dollars.
not,
When I was on the school board, it was a 6% budget cut, so $3.4 billion of new money is better.
let's see where we are. Not enough money, I think I already said that.
Prep for
Need-
counselors as mental health
Yes.
professionals.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in your feedback on this. So the counselor training requirements, the counselor certification exam. You think about how do we train counselors on mental health practices better? I mean, counselors are basically trained by universities because they all have to have master's degrees. So
Continuing education.
we have, the agency through SBEC has some control over this because we can control the certification exams. So therefore, we could shift the exam to sort of overweight mental health questions. I don't know if anybody has, like, do you want us to change the certification exam? Or is this just a conversation with higher ed? Do you want the legislature to pass like a you must have at least 6 hours of credit in a master's degree program for counseling on X, or would you want SBEC to pass that as a rule?
Commissioner, I really think when we're talking about things like that, and you know, Texas is changing rapidly. Our counselors are encountering traumas that they didn't encounter 8
Right.
years ago. And so it's not just a matter of certification or the training up there, but it's that ongoing training. in the
continuing
meantime.
development.
It's that constantly taking a look at what we're doing and is it meeting today's demand in those schools. So we have a hard time finding good training for our counselors to go to that target what they're encountering in the classrooms today. I'm sure you're aware of
So-
secondary trauma
Yeah.
that teachers are now encountering, right, from dealing with it.
Is
So-
that a similar, like, you simply can't find a supply of the training in this topic area that you need for your teams? Is that, do other people have that same problem?
But it's difficult to find.
The training you're talking about, yeah.
Well, and I think we need to draw some kind of a line in definition between the training for mental health professionals, which does include counselors, and people who provide treatment.
Yeah, because
There's a
yeah,
difference.
there is a difference.
And we're encountering more and more and more children who need treatment.
Yeah, so as we've been thinking about the Safe and Supportive Schools program, we're thinking about sort of an implementation support framework for this. Why don't we put on our homework assignments identification of what we think is best-in-class training for current counselors in the sort of more trauma-related sort of school-based case management stuff that we think they need.
And they have, they've got an association that I think if you write into the association, if you will, and say, please find more continuing education on this topic. You know, maybe if the association hears from those outside, not just the counselors, but that they would then have more continuing education that would address trauma, you know.
I think outside of just a school safety focus, I think all of us would agree that this notion of young people who require not just identification, but treatment is a pretty rapidly growing population. And that's an ecosystem that has to be built statewide, not just
Right.
within the K-12 system. We don't have good incentives for folks to leave high school and college and go into that work. It's hard work, it's generally not well paid, so I think there's room for us to think about what that whole ecosystem around treatment could look like, focused on young folks. I think we can take care of the identification, especially if we get higher quality training, but the treatment that's a whole.
Yeah, is there a
different-
sufficient supply of treatment for these
And I can
kids on a
guarantee, even
long-term
in
basis?
urban areas, the answer is no.
Yeah.
And it's so
God
short
bless
term.
our friends in
You'll-
more rural parts.
You'll
3
give
visits,
some
6
kind
visits.
of, treatment center, and they hold them for what, 15 days, and they're done.
Well, and there's difference
hold them.
between, you know,
Residential treatment.
residential
ongoing.
treatment, ongoing, and the field, I mean, we don't even have enough psychiatrists.
There's a,
Medicine-wise, we don't have enough.
so there's a mental health task force that is basically focused on this ecosystem question. Weirdly, we were not like written into the statutory requirements, but they've invited us to participate in said task force. This was one of the things that came out of Hurricane Harvey, was figuring out how we sort of asset map the sort of service providers that you would refer kids to. And so that work is happening. I can't say it's happening well, but we're moving into the direction that you've sort of identified.
All right, let's finish with that one. Threat assessment, the team's availability to meet the timeline, we talked about that, mental health support and funding. We only have a few more minutes before we send Commissioner on his way. So looking at now the interim charges, where are we heading with special ed?
Said, yeah. I'm feeling actually much better than I ever have before about what resources are being put in place to improve special education support. But that's a huge challenge. We have a strategic plan on special ed. We've made we've really made a bunch of progress in the last 3 years. Here's a fun fact. This year versus the year that I started, we're spending $1 billion more as a state on students in special education. just in like one,
Just-
annually. Identifications are way up, which you guys probably already knew. That is one of the reasons we're spending $1 billion more than we did 3 or 4 years ago. We have a special education strategic plan that includes SPED academies, somewhat akin to the reading academies, smaller scale and less expensive for you guys, so before you get freaked out about that. But I think that from an interim charge perspective, it's worthy for the committees to sort of entertain this question. We can report on what we know and where we're headed and get feedback from the field too on the progress to date. We're now monitoring in special education. Basically, we haven't been for, I don't know, a decade or 15, 20 years. That is both good news and bad news. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback so far from districts that went through monitoring. Anybody here been monitored so far this year in SPED? Okay, well, we have actually gotten some good feedback. People are like, hey, I would invite TEA to come back, which is not normally what we do. Because we tried to build the monitoring system so it's not like, here's the 55 things you screwed up, why are you so terrible, have a nice life. But instead, concentrate on like 3 or 4 action steps to drive real gains for kids. I don't know that we've got it right, but it's a lot better than our historic approach to like programmatic auditing.
Okay. Excuse me. Online assessments, 100% by 2022.
So it's not 100% by 2022. It's 5 years, not 2. In the way that the statute's kind of hard for people to read. I can see why people might think it's 100%. They think it's 100% by 2022. What it says is that we want to be 100% within 5 years. However, the statute sunsets in 2022 unless the legislature acts on it. They built that on purpose because they have to take action again before we continue going down this path to make sure that our infrastructure is keeping pace with this requirement. So we are moving in the direction of all online assessments. And we're being sensitive to the infrastructure requirements. You'll probably get some surveys from us this spring on that. Should every test be online is a kind of a good academic question. There's clearly kids that will, from accommodations perspective, need non-online tests, but virtually every test can be all online. Other states have already proven this to be true. So that's that one. A lot of work is happening in our assessment though, because the ledge passed a law that looks at really a fundamental redesign for the way summative assessment could potentially happen in Texas. Don't expect a quick movement on it. It's a big change, but they basically told us to go that direction.
The tax compression revenue caps. Interim charge for the DA provide counseling for transitioning students from placement to campus. Recruitment incentives for special education teachers, paraprofessionals, our licensed social workers and therapists, occupational, physical, speech, resources for mental health. We'll be looking at, the resources we have for those and our counselors, and we talked about that. Is there anything more specific on the interim charge to make sure when we talk about that I look at specifically what the question was?
Well, this is all going to be homework assignment for our team because we'll have to do all the data runs on this and prep briefing for the ledge.
So we'll try to track down what the supply side looks like for each of these
Professionals and see where it's going and are we trending in a good direction or not. I haven't seen the data specifically. My guess is we're not trending in a good direction. We'll try to put that together for hearing.
And then how do we ensure that the most challenging to educate students are equitable and distributed across all publicly funded schools? That's what we're monitoring.
That's a big question. I assume the Comp Ed allotment that just got tiered, you think that
this was a step in the right direction, but I don't know what else you would want. I mean, I have some ideas, but I don't know if somebody has, whoever wrote this.
what direction they wanted this to go.
Yeah, so this is a question around the disparity of the most severely disabled
disabled kids and where they're being educated, and frankly, where they're not being
The
educated.
mentally fragile.
And they have a tendency to be concentrated in certain areas. The funding gap,
For
the
those
more
kids.
disabled a kid, the bigger the funding gap. And so,
I'll tell you what would be very helpful for us is an accounting analysis on this.
not hard to do.
We have, we can pull the aggregate numbers from PEMS. The aggregate numbers from PEMS suffer from some unreliability issues because accounting practices aren't entirely consistent across districts, even though they're supposed to be. And it also is not broken out by like your 5 multiplier kids as opposed to your 1 multiplier kids in SPED. I have long hypothesized that the cost versus funding ratio, as you get more and more extreme, the delta gets bigger and bigger. But I haven't seen something that establishes it clearly
I think we can
from an
work on
evidence
that.
base.
And I think we could build an accounting system that would at least identify how big the delta is.
I would worry about that because if we build that accounting system, it's gonna have a whole lot of work for a lot of districts. I think you're much better off having bring in a university to do some detailed managerial accounting analysis in a subset of 3 or 4 districts and prove it out.
Yeah.
Because if we have to build a system, well, now you got all this extra data reporting that you're gonna do, it just increased your overhead costs for your accounting team.
So the other point to the question is that population of kids is our fastest growing population. They're being served in urban and suburban independent school districts by and large, period.
Yeah, and we have some reason to believe that there's word of mouth among parent communities causing more and more concentration. Basically, it's a choice schools approach for this group of kids. And so you're concentrating extremely expensive kids in certain systems.
And I can tell you
in
where they're
certain
not,
campuses.
and that's in Texas charter schools.
The rollout for HB 3906.
So that's the big assessment bill. So there's 8 different rollout plans because there's 8 or 9 different things that bill requires. So the big issue is expect to see some testing changes in the 2022 in spring of 2022. There'll be a lot more communications on that between now and then. That'll time with 3906 requirements and also time with the SBOE's new ELAR standards. So.
Okay. We've got to move this quickly. Outside of differentiated compensation, how do we improve teacher recruitment, retention?
You've asked the most complicated question. So it's pay and working conditions. So if you can improve working conditions and improve pay, you'll improve this. Recruitment is driven actually not as much by average pay as it is by top end pay, because at least that's what the survey data tells us. Retention, however, most people quit because they don't like their boss. So that is at least in part a you problem as it is a us problem. What I will say is that one of the things that we do very poorly in the aggregate in this country that we don't have to is our teachers are providing instruction for far too many hours a day. The average teacher in Texas is in front of kids for about 6 hours and 20 minutes per day. And in all of the countries that are beating us, that number is anywhere from 1 to 2 hours less per day. And if you think about the implications of it, what it means is that in order to be a good teacher in the United States, you have to commit to a 12-hour workday. And it's just really hard to keep people in a profession where that's the standard. An 8-hour workday is a far more sustainable situation. In order to do that, you got to put teachers in front of kids less than 6.5 hours a day. In order to do that, you got to completely revamp your master schedule, your staffing patterns, and typically commit to higher class sizes. And in some cases, that is what's happening in other countries to do that. And generally, the juice is worth the squeeze for long-term teacher retention. The extended school year is kind of an interesting place to innovate on this, where you could do this on an additive basis in a way that isn't potentially harmful. If you haven't watched our extended school year video, watch that. It kind of explains this problem and how you might approach it.
And we'll just hit one on each one. Retaining staff, we just talked balancing with discipline issues. I think that's so
historically have not trained our principals nearly as well as needed to be. Both of those have significant implications as to how discipline is maintained. Like, if you got a teacher that's just, their classroom management skills are bad, discipline problems start to show up when they didn't before. That's not like broader, say, restorative discipline practices or dealing with trauma. That's just like, a lot of this is setting right expectations when they're in kindergarten and being consistent throughout, and that's a function of us inadequately training teachers on classroom management practices in ed prep. So we're trying to fix that. We're trying to get much firmer in educator preparation with clinical residencies and clinical practices so people can practice their classroom management. We've also retooled the principal certification experience so that theoretically we'll have principals that are better at setting the stage for discipline. Then you have a different issue, which is like emotionally disturbed kids that are suffering from severe trauma that are like massively disruptive, and how do you manage that? We do not yet have a good systemic solution for that. I'm open to any suggestions that you have.
Okay, with that, we're gonna let you go. Thank you very much. I'm gonna keep all these and we will make a summary sheet. My office will get it out to you. And I think it's been great. I appreciate you being here so much and helping us with this.